we're just gonna make marks on paper. Now, how we make those marks on paper, I always analyze how we use this tool. So I use a charcoal pencil, or I also have charcoal stick. Now, if you don't have charcoal, pencil's fine. I did suggest this because of the type of mark making we could do. You're gonna see the difference. And there are some other types of charcoal willows, smaller square charcoal sticks. I will be using mostly the charcoal pencil, but I want you to know, no matter which one you are using, you would use this tool with the overhand grip. So if you're grabbing your tool like this is how we were all taught to hold a pencil or a drawing tool. And the fact is, you actually knew how to do it right before anyone told you that that was not the way. This is the way you hold for writing. And if you notice my posture, when I hold a tool like this, I only have limited motion. I can move my wrist, but then everything feels awkward because it is designed for writing. Now, when you were maybe 10 months old, a year and a half old, you were probably grabbing it like this and making your marks like this. And that made sense. It's not a hammer either, where you would hold it. You know, you grab a hammer like this for a reason. So if you hold your tool the way it's supposed to be used, I think that would be success for a session like this. So the way I want you guys to really try it out and catch yourselves, because if you haven't done this before, it will feel uncomfortable. It will be like using, if you're right-handed, it'll be like using your left hand, because, you know, forcing yourself to use the left hand. It'll be awkward at first, but believe it or not, you will become so efficient at it. So you're going to grab your index finger, your middle finger, and you're going to just press your thumb right on top. And now you realize that you have, and the longer you grab it, so I'm grabbing it all the way at the end, you'll realize that I will have full control of range of motion. So notice that any little movement on my wrist now gets me from here to here. If I were grabbing it like this, I would pretty much have to move my elbow, my arm, and it will give you my range of motion just with the fingertips, just with the wrist, or even with the elbow. Now I'm going in every direction, with the full range of motion to cover the full page. But also it allows me to control the pressure. So I have extremely light pressure, you could barely see it, to just by squeezing a little bit harder, fuller pressure. Okay, so that is the one thing that I want you to walk away from this class. Today, what was the one thing? The proper grip. Proper grip for drawing, not for writing. Now, if you need more control as I work on details, you still use the same grip. You only grab it a little bit shorter. So the closer you get to the tip, the more control you'll have over drawing some of the smaller lines and details that you will need. So try that, test it out at different lengths. If you're grabbing it too close, you're going to be smudging maybe. So midway, light pressure, and here we go. So for the first exercise, I want you to test out. I'm going to show you some of the hints, some of our clues. How would we draw this figure? Where would we start is question one. So for me, I want you to take steps. And the things that we're going to work on are sculpting the drawing, getting ourselves setting up for success. So most of us would probably start with the head and work our way around the figure. And then we realize, oops, my arm is a little shorter than it looks, or the back is a little bit longer, off angle. So what I want you to think about is how we build a house. You have a lot, and then you pretty much tear everything down, you level it, then you dig holes, so it's really rocky, muddy, messy. But then little by little, you begin to put foundations, and then you take measurements, and you put some pillars, and some cement, some blocks. All of a sudden it starts looking like what it eventually will be. Then we build some structures and some walls, and all of a sudden you're putting decorations and painting and hanging things on the walls. And that's the last little level. So why would you start doing detail when you're still working on a lot. So the idea would be to construct from biggest to smallest, from simplest to more complex. And then the last one would be from lightest, and I mean lines, to darkest. So if I were to take a figure like this, I would take my longest lines and measure with very light lines from the very biggest shapes so I could begin to carve out the smaller shapes. And then from the simplest angles and shapes to the more complex. So here's what I want to show you. Step one would be something like, oops, not like that, like this. So if you see these little red dots, I want to see what is my highest point. If I'm going to use this whole page for my drawing, I want to make sure, I don't know if this ever happened to you where you're drawing something and all of a sudden, whoops, you run out of room on one of the sides of the page. This is probably why. Because you want to know what your margin at the top would be, what your margin at the bottom would be. And now having a measurement like this kind of gives you a sense of, without using any type of ruler or any other tool to measure, could you tell me if this drawing that you're about to do is taller than it is wider, or is it wider than it is taller, or is it the same? So that would be stage 2 of it. We want to find out, and again, you're not supposed to draw these lines. This is all visualizing it. Now you may pick up some of these as your method. And I'm not saying this is the way you do it. You're supposed to. Some things might make sense and some may not. But the key for me would be to figure out what is the relationship between this measurement and this measurement. And I found that there are ways where if I take the height and then the width and I find a relationship between it. So notice that my width, if I were to just take it up, it's past halfway. I would say just about a third of the way past middle. So I already have, again, an idea in my head that this is longer than it is wider or taller than it is wider. And I have an idea of how much taller it is than it is wider. So I'm already breaking away from the square. From here, there's another way where I could actually mark the center. And that is very helpful. Once you have a marking for the center, you know that this distance, let's say to this elbow here, would be the same distance from here to the knee. And I'm just drawing these lines to kind of help you visualize a little more. Because once I find my center, everything relates to this spot. So notice that the other elbow is, if I were to draw this middle, notice that the elbow would be on this quadrant and a little bit below it. And it just helps you begin to place everything with much more ease once you have that type of measurement. So it is some of these that I want you to think about. I don't want it to sound too overwhelming. I'm just going over lots of mental pictures that you're supposed to have when we look at an entire figure. This is another way. Now, if I take my figure and I can actually see it almost as a marble stone, visualize it as a marble stone, and I could then remember those markings I made in the beginning where I have my highest, lowest, and widest, somewhere like that. I could then kind of make some markings that would begin to give me kind of a map. And this is something that is way easier to draw. Wouldn't you agree? I could begin to see that, no, it should be a little wider. I could see that, for example, this angle here needs to be a little straighter, not so angled in this direction. I could see the relationship between these points. And from here, I could, and again, I'm not saying you have to draw this, but this is one method. And this is called the envelope. I put everything that I'm going to draw inside an envelope. Now, from here, I could just begin to carve out. So let me show you again. Once I begin to see this, I could carve it out. So once I have my envelope, I could begin to take smaller angles. And remember that we're going from big to smaller. So we begin to look at angles instead of legs, arms, and things that are just going to confuse us even more. So notice that I begin to look at just simple lines, simple angles within an envelope, and it should make it a lot easier. And now our brain begins to say, hey, wait a minute, I know what this starts to look like. I could see, again, we're going to try to use language, an arm and a leg, but from biggest to smaller, we're also using that technique of from simple shape to more complex. So the first one was the simplest. This one begins to be more complex. Then we have, notice again, I'll switch it, even more complex. So those original lines begin to break up even more. And that's where we begin to make our lines just a little bit darker, just a little bit more angled, and what some would call more detailed. Maybe a couple of curves. As you notice, I have only used mostly straight lines to define what I was looking for. So these are some of those, this is where we're headed throughout the lesson. So I'm getting way ahead of me. And this is the final thing. Considering not just this guy, but the space around it. So the shapes that you actually see outside of the subject. And what does that mean? If I were to show you this, and I asked you to draw the red shape, that red thing, you would come up with something that looks, and I'm going to do this right here, just shading here, something that would look somewhat like this. And I'm kind of just coloring in this area. So you can begin to see that it's way easier to draw this shape. Now, if I point you to it, this is the shoulder and this is the neck of that same figure. Can you see it? But I closed in so you don't focus on the thing. You actually focus on the simplicity of the shape. And it's going to be way easier because your brain can do this. Your brain can shift from positive to negative space. So when we're looking at a neck and a shoulder, sometimes we think we know what it looks like, so we take shortcuts. But if instead we look at the space around it and we actually pay attention to what it's doing, we are going to get way closer because we're using both of the elements, the positive and the negative. So we can do that. Okay, so this was my demo, and now we're going to get to drawing. So hopefully you have your pad and your charcoal or pencil ready. And the exercise that I want to do first is going to be this one here. So with this image that you have on screen, I'm actually going to put something else on screen. I hope you can see it. And that's a 30-second clock. So we're about to do 5 drawings in 30 seconds. And some of you are thinking, wait, what are you doing? Are you serious? Yes. So I want to show you what we're looking for. Now, we're not drawing this entire figure like I'm showing you here. What I'm looking for is something more like this. If you end up with something like this that you see on screen now, which is, again, you're going to see just a circle for the head, somewhat of a curve for the back, a little angle for the shoulders, maybe one for the arm. And we can even count these lines. I would say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. I'm looking at the angle. 9 and 10. Something like this we can do in 30 seconds. Would you agree? So hopefully, again, you're taking all of the things I mentioned. This has to be way longer than it is wider because you can see it immediately. Now, sometimes you're going to take these 30 seconds and maybe you just take 10 seconds without drawing to look at it. Because the exercise that I want you to really focus on today is observation, not taking your eyes off of the subject. And that's one that it's called blind drawing, where you keep your eyes on the actual reference, on the subject, and you're drawing without looking at your paper. Maybe you glance every 10 seconds for 1 second just to make sure you're still on the right position. But what we're going to do now is we're going to go ahead and draw 5, and I want to show you again, of these, starting with this one. So I'm going to start the clock. And again, purpose of this is just to get some markings on your paper. Now, you may want to consider doing 2, 3, or 4 on one page, because we're going to do about 30 drawings today. So if you have 30 pages to spare, you might not want to use a whole page for some of these. You might want to do 2 or 3, but don't make them too small. The idea here is to practice your grip, keep your eyes on the subject, and then practice a little bit of that blind drawing, meaning you're not looking at your paper, you're looking at the reference. And by doing that, you begin to see what you're supposed to transfer. So I'm going to try to do 2 per page. And because we're doing 5, here we go. I'm going to start the clock. And I'm going to start just like I did with a circle for the head. I'm going to get a sense of just that curve in the back, a little angle. Again, the more you keep your eyes on the subject, you're going to realize you don't lose your place, because all of a sudden you realize you're doing an exercise in observation, not in drawing. And done. So if you ended up with something like this, congratulations. That's all. That is all you need. So this is just a warm-up exercise. And it's supposed to show you if you're a little bit too slow, you need to speed them up. If you're focusing too much on one area, you need to consider the whole thing, all of it. And it's supposed to be loose and gestural, very geometric. Let's go to number 2. There we go. And I'm going to start the clock again. Quick for the head. Now I have an angle at the shoulders. I'm going to draw the line for the leg. A little curve for this foot, for this leg, coming into the hip. Elbow and the hand. And that should do it. As long as we can begin to read, there's a form. Now, some of you might still feel comfortable. Let me go to a next page. With something that might look like this. And we're going to kind of make them a little 2-stick figure. I have a clue. And I want to show you what it's going to be. It's going to be this same one. Now, notice that when we have this image, we could actually go a little bit further. Instead of making our little guy like this, I might want to add, and hopefully you're working and reworking this one again, all of the major, for example, major points here would be the chest, the rib cage, if I could visualize that, the hip bone and the angle of it, and then the lines and the major joints, which would be where the knee connects with this one, which is a little bit higher, maybe the ankles, definitely the shoulders. Notice that one shoulder is higher than the other. So this shoulder is lower, comes down. Don't really pay attention to the elbow because I see a nice little shape there that brings me into the wrist or the hand. So I'm doing a little extra step to take me from this to adding a little bit more curvature and volume to the beginning of my figure. So it would be more something like this if you're struggling with finding those angles and finding those quick relationships. Okay? Next one, we're going to, this is number 3, reset the clock, and go ahead and try what I just did. So we're going to start with Again, a sense of for the head. I'm going to just look at those shoulders and go right into the direction towards the elbow. Put something for the rib cage. And I see a little turn of the hip here in the opposite direction that then brings me straight down, right to the knee, across, and down. Now, I hope you're not feeling overwhelmed. Remember, this is just an exercise in warming up our mark making. So eventually, you're going to loosen up. The idea is to loosen up. So let me keep flowing with the work here. Let's do without thinking too much. Just begin to let your lines and your observation skills, what you begin to look for. Starting the clock again. This is number 4. Here we go. So once again, I'm going to start with the angle of the head here, a circle, a nice couple of lines for the neck, the tilt. Now, interesting, I have a shoulder that's further away, ones that's closer. The way I like to do it is go right into the major joints, the relationship between that and the shoulder and the elbow, giving you a nice read into the knee and the relationship between that one and the one behind it. And that should be it. Okay, so that was quick. And number 5. And they get a little more interesting as we move along. Turn my page and start our clock. 30 seconds. I'm going to start with, once again, the head. And if I want to get a little fancy, if I have extra time, I give it the posture, the face. Right into the shoulder, right into the elbow, right into the wrist. The curve for the chest, I see a little bit of room right there in the back. Right into the knee, right into the foot, and right into this foot. And that should do it. Now, the relationships, remember, this is way taller than it was wider. So you want to make this, definitely make a good reading in the proportion of the lines that would allow you to do that. Okay, so if that was lots of fun, I'm happy because guess what? We get to do it all over again. But this time, I'm going to switch this clock into this one. So now we're going to double the time. We're going to double the time and do these 5 drawings again. I'm not going to talk too much over them. It's going to be the same type of process where I begin to maybe find myself with a little more time than I did with these first 5. And let's see how that goes. So let me start the clock. And as we become more familiar, let's see, I start with my head. And I, again, begin to familiarize my thoughts to what I did before. Get a read right into the elbow, right down through the back. And I want to make sure I pay attention to those angles. Meaning, some of these angles, if they're more vertical or they begin to turn away, these type of angles and the distance, the length of them, now I begin to see some separation between the limbs. I could maybe go a little bit into, for the first time, into the figure. And I find myself finishing pretty much the entire thing. Now, I forgot to say one thing. Make sure you label them. So this is a 1 minute, just a 1M. The previous ones, I hope you can remember to go back and put a 30-second. So you remember when you go back and you look at the process. Because it will be hard to tell sometimes if this was a 1 minute, 2 minute, 30-second. Let's go to number 2. Start the clock. And all of a sudden, I found myself with, wow, That was a lot, actually a lot of time. So because I'm working a little faster, and it's not about working fast, it's about working loose. It's about keeping your eyes on the subject and being able to free your hand a little more. It almost begins to feel like you're drawing with your eyes, where your hand just responds to what you see. And you begin to see easier angles, curves. Make easy corrections, because remember, this is just a quick sketch. And all of a sudden I found myself with 12 seconds left. So we could begin to look at negative space, some of those separation. And that is where we begin to get in trouble, actually, because we're going to need way more time for that kind of drawing. But some features that we see, simple lines, that will give me a 1 minute. Let's go to number 3. There we go. Reset the clock. And start. So immediately I recognize it's the same kid, but now the pose is showing me much more frontal. So the shoulder distance, there's one shoulder that's higher, this one's lower. I could see the rib cage and the belly turning away. So I could kind of begin to observe a little more, let's call it again, detail in terms of the length and the curve. So it slows down a little, but not too much. We want to make sure we stay loose. Number 1 is to actually find a way to stay loose all the way through and just find enough information that will eventually set you up for success. Now I'm making these a little bit darker than I usually would in the beginning, because the way you develop from step 1 to step 2 to step 3, eventually to finishing up a drawing, it's a lot lighter. And step by step, it will get darker. Okay, so we go to number 4. 1 minute. Start the clock. And once again, take my time. Begin to read a little more. Better relationships. Maybe kind of start doing away with so much of that simplistic kind of ball work that I've done for the joints, and make it a little more organic. I want to begin to get a sense of the curvature of some of these muscles. You can actually see the weight. Begin to get a sense of the weight of some of these limbs. Like, for example, the weight is completely on this leg, and this one is just hanging back, as we see a piece of the foot here. And finish up with this arm. Now, this takes a lot of practice. This may be the first time you've ever done this before. And this is something that in a live figure drawing class, you would do somewhere between 30 and 50 of these. And they're all 30 seconds, 1 minute. And before you know it, you are going to find such ease seeing and transferring these lines. So don't get frustrated. Just keep looking, keep staying loose. Let me restart the clock. And this is our number 5. And just stay with it. Just keep making marks. Hopefully you're catching yourself. What I mentioned before, where your eyes are. Are your eyes on your paper way too long, or are they on the reference? Are you looking at what you're drawing? And I wish you could see with the split camera, that at some point, there we go. So it starts feeling like it's actually a lot of time. Now that we pushed up to 1 minute and you get more familiar with this figure, you're going to begin to identify which pose it was. And that's the whole idea. You begin to get a full read in 1 minute where you can identify all the major fundamental structural things that you need to cover in order to have a good figure drawing. Perfect. Oops, there we go. Okay, so we go back to number 1. And now we're going to move to 3-minute drawings. Here comes the true test. So just so you know, the idea is to go from 30 seconds to 1 minute. I skipped 2 minutes so we can squeeze in a couple more later on because I probably used a little too much time in that intro. But it goes from 30 seconds to 1 minute to 2 minute to 3 minute to 5 minute to then a few 10 minutes to then 1 15-minute and then eventually a half hour. And you'll find yourself with just tons of information where half hour becomes a fully finished drawing. And then maybe you could actually do it in a couple of sessions of 2 30-minute of the same pose where you're spending 1 hour on just one pose. Today we're just trying to get to that, from 30 seconds to 1 minute, 3 minute, 5 minute, and maybe a couple of 10 minutes. And you'll eventually realize, wow, here is where the big test begins, because you're going to find yourself with extra time. Now you know what you can do in 30 seconds, 1 minute. With 3 minutes, we're going to begin to stiffen up, maybe switch our grip, and start trying to detail some muscle and some... Thank God these are kind of simplistic, so there's not a lot of lighting or detail, but you're going to want to start doing the hair. And if you have that much time in 3 minutes, that's great. But try to stay in that 30-second mentality all the way through. Okay, so I'm going to start the clock, and I'm going to dedicate a full page for this one. Once again, it's not a race. It's not about the time. The idea is I just programmed the class so we could go through as much material and, again, as much drawing as possible. I could begin to focus a little more and notice how we begin to stay stuck on one area. No, you want to just get that first full read like you did earlier. So we're still here. I'm getting some of these relationships, and I'm also getting the sense of the angle, the distance. Getting a little too close here at the bottom. And I get my fundamental basic structure. Notice that I made my lines a lot lighter. And this is for reasons, of course, we don't want to be erasing later on. So you just build up your drawing little by little. I'm going to get a little more sense of volume here. And I'm going to get a sense of that back, that curvature, just a couple hints of muscle, and begin to see how the lines relate to each other. So now I'm going to begin to move away into stage 2. So if you remember that envelope, I got the envelope. Now I'm going to begin to see some of these smaller shapes. And I still want to stay away from any type of curve. So notice that I'm reading these as just angular lines. And in this sketch, this reference photo that we have here, you actually see them. You see them as straight angles almost. For the most part, really. Maintaining your grip, keeping your eyes. And again, here you might begin to switch over to your paper a little too much. Actually is where you should force yourself to really remain with your eyes on the subject, because as you got your main structure developed, you're going to begin to read smaller features. That means you really need to observe. And how do you observe if you're not looking? So keeping your eyes on your reference 95 to 98% of the time is absolutely crucial. Absolutely crucial. If you could do it 100% of the time, wow, that is actually great practice, and it can be done. I do it all the time. You just get a sense of where your mark making is, meaning your sense of the full size of the paper, and that's it. So this is our first 3-minute. I'm going to make sure I label it. So you begin to see the big difference. It's the stage 2. So we did stage 1. Now this begins to be stage 2, as it's almost more fully developed, and we could easily begin to identify not just the pose, but more of the anatomical things that are going on with the muscle in this figure. Okay, so we're going to do the same with this image. 3 minutes. And same thing. I'm going to try to squeeze 2 in this page. And I'm going to force myself to really keep my eyes on the subject 98 to 99% of the time. How do I do that? I do not look down at my paper. I get a sense areas like right after I finish this line here, where I could find my place again. I'll take a quick glance at my charcoal placement. Maybe make a quick correction just to get the proportions right. But overall, my eyes remain on my image, on the reference image, nearly 100% of the time. So there it is. I look down. Wow, I would be pretty happy. Now I begin to cut the time down. Observation, absolutely key here. I'm going to start by what I consider, and this is one of those areas where I'm looking at negative space here instead of the actual subject. So I'm looking at those shapes between what would be the chin and the shoulder here. Some of the angles without stiffing up, staying loose. A little bit of this negative space between the legs. And just again, mark making all the way through. Simple mark making, loosening up, practicing your grip, maybe your brand new grip, which again, it's going to be the most important thing, if any, of today. Having you test out what kind of marks, what kind of lines, what kind of things, full range of motion can you develop with this new way of holding your tool. And for a 3-minute drawing, I'm ready to call it. That's as far as you need to go. Now, can I actually make corrections here? Yeah. With a longer time that we will eventually have, I would know where to make the proper corrections. But this is pretty close to a good structure to build a drawing from. Excellent. Okay, we're going to go to number 3. 3 more minutes. And starting it. So again, with observation, going back, it's not actually going back. That feeling is still with you all the way through. What we were doing early on with those 30-second ones, where you're literally getting a sense of the whole. Instead of focusing on smaller parts, you want to focus on that big whole thing, simplifying all the way through. And if you can actually get all the way to the end while still drawing like this, it's actually how the masters did it. So if you ever look at Leonardo, Michelangelo, you name them, any master artist, and you look at their sketches, you're going to realize they were doing this all the way through. They just did it with much, much more. I mean, the amounts of practice they had. Every stroke they made looked finished. But you'll see that they're working in and out, and they just, a line that didn't go there, they left it. Oh, I should have had some samples. I'll show you some next week, because it's always a great way to, and it's eye-opening to say, oh, wow. Most people would consider those like, oh, look at all the mistakes they made. No, actually, I think it's what beautifies, like makes them, you could see their process. You could see how they were seeing. Now I'm moving around, trying to get better relationships in some of these areas. Looking at both angles, some of the lines, and negative space. No detail at all. No detail whatsoever. Just lines, 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 lines. The direction of the line and how one line relates to another. So for example, here I have a nice little triangle. Do I look at the forearm arm, or is it easier to draw that little shape of negative space? That's where we're headed. So if you focus on both and you get a good read, you are going to be very precise. And you see, as I find myself with 20 seconds left, that feels good. That eventually feels good. It means you're flowing and your mark making is becoming more confident. You're actually really paying attention to what you're supposed to be paying attention. And notice how your brain all of a sudden kind of hits a soft zone of not having to name things, this thing and this thing, which we have to name it. No, now we see it as what it looks like without having to add complexity to it. Let's see. Yes. Oh, that's good. You know what? I'm going to switch just for you with the thickest one I have. And again, it's getting used to your tool. What can your tool do for you? And figuring out that if you can find an edge, and as you draw, you can actually create sharp points. But for most of the time, let me go ahead and show you with this one. So it's a charcoal stick like this. Okay, let's go for that one. Perfect. Yeah, I should have switched a while back. And let's see how it works. Okay, so we're going to do number 4, and it's also going to be 3 minutes. Sorry, let me reset that very, very quick. And there we go. Yes, they do. Yeah. Yes, they do. Not really. If you want to use a softer one, so if you have a 2B, I would recommend 2B. HB or 2B would be the one you want to use. If you have like a dark, higher number, 4B, 6B, that means they're darker and they're way softer too. So right now you want something that's creamy, that's loose. And I'll go in a little more into that next time. But okay, let's go ahead and start the clock. 3 minutes. And I'm going to be using this charcoal stick. So the advantages of this, it could be, again, using it as line, Or you could begin to think in shapes, meaning I could use the whole side of it to actually get, begin to get shapes of it, out of it. I'm sorry. And again, using the line, using the same method we were using before, the same approach, meaning looking for the basic fundamental shapes. But it actually opens up way more possibilities. And notice how I'm rotating it. So I keep rotating it. So I'm not using the same edge all the time. And as I rotate it, it kind of gives me little sharp edges. And obviously, as I continue using that little edge, it'll become a little duller, little by little. So I rotate it in my fingers once again. This is what's bothering me here. So we begin to, I lost a little bit of my focus there. Observation-wise. And again, we'll switch it back. We'll turn it on, because it turns on and off. You can turn it on and off. And it is, again, getting in sync with what you can get out of the tool. But overall, the key is being able to decode what's going on in terms of shape, in terms of relationships between those shapes, the angles of some of these lines, the proportional relationships between those shapes and lines, beginning to read the negative space, while at the same time using the tool in creative ways. So this is one way. I'll go ahead and just use line for the next one. This was kind of getting way ahead of where we are now. But it is a really fun way to use charcoal. It's actually why you use charcoal. Later on, we would see that. So I'll probably do it with the next one. And obviously, your fingers begin to look like this. So every time you touch anything or your pages, you're going to have, yeah. Okay. Let's go to number 5. There it is. Reset the clock. 3 minutes. I'm going to be using the same charcoal stick, but this time I'm going to be looking more for that original line drawing that I was doing earlier. So again, I'm going to loosen up. I have my grip, so I'm going to use less pressure and develop my drawing. And again, I want to really pay attention, that feel that I had early on with that 30-second, 1 minute kind of flow. So I could see the relationship between some of these shapes. Develop the lines first. And in a way, kind of quiet the mind, letting your eyes do all what they know how to do. Observe, analyze, decode, simplify. And you're using all those little tactics, strategies that I gave you early on, which is looking at the angles and simplified shapes, the negative space, but without having to think about them. So there's my line work with the charcoal stick. You could see it. And now that I have something like this, I could begin to thicken as I continue adding lines. Remember, this is just our fundamental structure. So I'm looking for what would be what I consider the most important angle, lines, shapes that will set me up for success. So these lines begin to get a little darker. No detail whatsoever. You want to completely stay away. Even if you have the time, that means you're drawing really, really fast. That's great. If you are accurate and fast, that is excellent. But you want to make sure you are not getting ahead of yourself, because the idea here is not to finish the whole drawing as opposed to just a 3-minute sketch. Making sure you're paying attention, giving it time to develop and give you a better understanding of the whole subject. So there we go. And where we would go from here, you could actually grab some of this and add some of that charcoal as you begin to see it develop. Okay, so this was a 3-minute. And we are ready to move on to stage 4. Okay, so now we're going from 3 minutes to 5 minutes. Now this one's going to present what will be a bigger challenge. You're going to now find yourself with almost double the time. So your strategy is to hold back and feel like you're in that 30-second mode. Not mentally like, oh my God, I got to finish 30 seconds. No, but the looseness of it. As long as you can. If you get to a point where you want to begin to add detail, be careful. Hold yourself back. That's the biggest tip I can give you. It's restraint. It's hold yourself back, stay loose, stay in that sketch mode. Okay, so I'm going to start the clock and I'm going to stick with this charcoal stick and develop my lines. Once again, we're becoming way more familiar. We're becoming way more familiar with the subject. But immediately, something happens in my brain where I realize I have more time. You kind of want to slow down and start detailing. Don't do that. You want to keep that analytical, observational mode we've been all along. Putting it together. This might be a little too big. Didn't get my full range here. Let's see. So we're still at a stage where I can make corrections. And it's very close again, very close. Where I begin to just place strategical. These are just, again, almost like an envelope. I just want to make sure I'm covering the whole size of my subject in order to have a proper composition, a proper and I'm going to have to actually limit the size, make my correction immediately where I went too big with the head. So this is going to have to resize itself to smaller. And it's one of those things that happens. Kind of like when we go out to eat and our eyes are bigger than our stomach, they say. So here I wanted to make it a little bit too big. Now I take a look, second look, analyze, and it's becoming a little more proportional. I could actually begin to do something else. I want to show you this. So some of these areas here, I could develop it by drawing a line, or if you have a charcoal stick, you can actually develop them by working the negative space. So in more than one way, you can create lines by drawing them or by actually separating them from the background. And that is a great way to work a around some of your figures. You'll realize it's really, really handy when you have some interesting lighting situations. So this one I want to make a little more gestural, and I'm going to keep it because it's going to get a lot darker. I want to make sure I work patiently. We're at the 2-minute mark. So you still have 2 minutes left. Imagine that. I'm sure you feel like you're almost finished with all the type of training we've done so far up to this point. It feels like, well, it actually is almost double the time. So what do I use it for? And again, as I move along, I'm getting great reads, great relationship between the parts, better understanding of the angle of the lines, being able to go back and take a second look to make corrections, adjustments, without committing to a finished drawing in any one area. I'm looking at all the parts, building them slowly. And as I focus, for example, here on this area here, I could begin to see all the small little breaks and actually take a good look at direction of the line, angle of the line, size of the line. I could begin to add some of the background, some of the secondary elements. There we have it. Now, notice that I had zero detail when it comes to anything other than the outlines of the figure. This should actually give you a really good sense of how far you can go. Because remember, this was only a 5-minute sketch. We're still warming up. Perfect. Let's go to number 2. Reset the clock. And start. At some point, you may want to test yourself. Okay, how light can I go to start it off? Maybe I can go lighter. Again, with that same approach that we've had all along. Keeping your eyes on the subject. Some of the pointers that I love to give away is, how far out is this chest line from the face line? If they're lined up, I'm off. So you always want to be, as I'm drawing this, I want to make sure that I have a relationship, a sense of it, that I know it's further to the left as I come down, then this hip lines up past the farthest edge of the left side of the head. So all these little relationships all the way along at this stage is not just the angle, not just the shapes, but the relationship between those shapes, especially in the limbs here, for example, with the knees, the distance from it. I have to make sense. I have another clue here with the hand. So notice that the hand and this knee have a relationship, and it's this angle. So is it higher, lower? It's about right there. And I get that intuitive sense of where to place my mark. And now I have a knee, a hand to kind of triangulate and place my foot. So all these little clues that are everywhere, learning how to use them without overthinking is going to be crucial for successful figure drawing. And the beautiful thing is, everything I'm saying doesn't matter because you are going to write your own rules. You are going to figure out what are the steps, what are the ways of all of these methods that work for you. And you're going to come up with your own way. And we are all going to ask, how did you do that? Because that's the way it works. It's the way you see it. And I keep reminding you, are your eyes on the paper or are they on the subject? This, when we begin to get here in the 3-minute, 5-minute, the tendency is to stare at your paper. So what is it that you're drawing? You're not looking anymore. So ask yourself, okay, so what am I drawing? Things that I think I know. Like I know how a head looks. Whether you're drawing a head, shoulder, legs, you're drawing something that you think you know what it looks like, but it's not what you're supposed to be looking at anymore. So the key, number one, is never stop looking at your reference. And the more you stay with it all the way through, you'll realize that's what it is. This is just an exercise to learn how I observe. What do I see? How do I see it? And then how do I translate it? That just comes with practice, time. But the key is, how do you see it? So if you're not looking at it, what's going on? Makes sense, right? It is the key. And it is the one thing that I catch over and over and over. That urge to want to make it look perfect without looking at the reference. It seems impossible. Even if you had photographic memory, there's so many things that just come from observation. And there's time. So it is tricky. It is tricky. We notice, and I hope you feel. It is about how you feel. Drawing, I think it's pretty much a lot about how you feel. There's days where you feel you just can't, and there's no feeling. So notice how you're feeling. If you're feeling tighter, anxious, if you catch yourself thinking, what are those thoughts? Because you have to kind of maintain that sense that you had early on. And that's why this exercise that we did today so far is so great. You have no time to think. But now that you find yourself with more time to think and to act and to do, catch yourself. What's going on? And that feeling. If you begin to get more focused on the details, that's a clue. You're kind of pushing away from where you're supposed to be. Okay, one more. So this is number 3. Okay, 5-minute clock. I'm going to switch back over to the charcoal pencil. And again, there's all different kinds. I have this willow. Let me go ahead and try this willow. So this is just a nice, much lighter. For those of you who have a different one. This I use mostly for painting on canvas because it could just literally wipe away. But it's also used for drawing. So I'm going to start very easy with a nice read, and I like to get a sense of that once I have my head, and I like to go sometimes right into the chest, that rib cage, before I develop the angle of the shoulders. You kind of begin to get a sense of the weight, where the weight is, how the pose, the gesture of the pose, the feel of it. So in sports, there's a saying, be the ball. Here, you have to be the subject. Sometimes it actually helps, and I would totally encourage it to get up and actually do the pose. Understand the pose like an actor would by doing it, by actually standing. If you're ever interested in really understanding a pose, you have to understand it by doing it yourself. So one way is that, to just stand in the same way, put the weight, and you'll realize that the meaning of that word understanding all of a sudden changes everything. It really does. You see it in a whole new way. Now we're going to get into more of these secondary lines here, some of the angles. And I could keep this very simple with better understanding, all of it observation. And then beyond this, it's understanding anatomy. If that's the interest, you have to go a little bit further. You need to understand how muscles overlap, pinch, fold. You obviously need to understand how the bone structure helps create the pose and what it does to the muscle structure, and on and on and on. It's a matter of how much understanding you need to put into what you're doing. And I saw that I kind of froze for a second there. We still have a minute left. But just like in everything, understanding the relationship between things, between everything, ideally, and allowing them to be how they truly are. It's a good metaphor too, because in the end, it's a conversation about shapes, about lines. And there we have it. Oh my gosh. Breaking up. Can everybody hear me? Can everybody hear me okay? Can you guys hear me? Okay. So we move on. So we have one more. Actually, wait a minute. We have two more. So let's see. 15. I'm actually going to make this one because we're running out of time. So the exercise would continue with 5 minute, 5 minute. But I'm going to go ahead and make one last one. And let's go all the way back to the beginning to this one. And we're going to make this one 10 minutes. We have 10 minutes left. And I usually leave a little cushion at the end. So before 7:30, I open it up for Q&A, and so you guys can show me some of your work, hopefully, so I can give you some pointers and what I see. So this one we're going to make a 10-minute. So talking you through it, I would actually use a technique where I would start with something like this, with a willow, which is so soft, maybe you don't even see it there. And that's the way you actually would start a drawing like this, where I have to actually lean in and look very closely to see the lines. So you might be able to see them if I put them closer. That's how light you would want some of these lines to be, where only you could see them. And as you develop this first, yes, in my mind, I know we have 10 minutes, which is plenty of time. I want to never forget that gestural feel I had early on. And it's about not the 30 seconds, but it's about the type of read that I did to the whole figure and the relationships that I could see early on with very basic, very simple lines. Some of the spacing between it. And again, it could be very blocky. It could be very envelope-like. Now notice, for example, when I'm setting up this foot, and again, I'm going to call it a foot. Notice that it lines up right underneath our elbow. So in this straight line, I see all these relationships. So this foot, the placing of it, is it a little bit further back? Once I think of the angle and the size, I also want to think about the relationship to the elbow, this part of the leg, the distance between it. And starting my drawing like this, I actually will have much more room to develop that second layer of lines. And I'm going to stay with this willow as I can control a little bit better the point. Take a little longer to really analyze that line. Simplify it just a little bit more. This is not detail. These are still geometric lines. But I think to this pose, the relationship between the tilt forward of the head, the weight of the head going forward, and this part of the neck and the back, how it sits and kind of rolls and curves backwards, is crucial to describe this pose. Also the way the leg sits here, the way the foot, but this part, the neck and the back, and the way this neck points gives us pretty much a lot of the focal point for me goes there. I want to make sure I take my time, and it's not working detail. Once again, it's breaking, minimizing some of these smaller. Notice that they're very sharp, smaller lines, still angular. As I begin to describe other areas, I keep myself focused on what I'm supposed to be looking at. Not detail, but once again, the simplicity of the angle of the line, the direction, and the relationships. not slowing yourself down, keeping that nice pace where you're not just focused on one little area anymore, but the whole thing. So here I see a nice, and because a little bit of knowledge, how this part of the hip turns, and you can actually see the muscle. A little line, there's a tiny little line right here that gives you that whole clue. How it just turns right into the glute and gives us the position of these two lines right here, which become very important, kind of the setup of the back. So it starts off with this one, and we read how close it is to the other side and how there's a little bit of a curve here as it straightens out, curves back in, and right into the muscle of the back. So there we go. There's a little bit of that muscle coming off, and you can see the weight of the pose right here. As you could read that muscle, that takes us again right back into the upper part of the thigh. And again, I'm still keeping it very angular. Trying to minimize and simplify. Here I could use a little bit of that negative space. So I'm not looking at just the actual subject, the leg, but the shape of that little triangular negative space that happens right in between these two. And it's crucial. It just gives you all the clues, everything you need to know right there. So notice that as I look like I'm focused on one area, I'm actually still in that stage of very quick understanding where the gesture is still what matters. Meaning the quick understanding with simplified lines, a little bit more observation. And I got to say, my eyes have been 95% of the time on the image, on screen, on the reference, not on my paper. I'm going to add some of these connecting features here. There we go. And now I'm going to switch over to the charcoal pencil. And what you would want to do here, yeah, you're going to add some, again, more in that sketch mode, kind of confirming some of these lines where we begin to move from simple to less simple to more complex. This would be the beginning of complex, where you begin to see some anatomical curvature, some insinuation of muscle, where you take some of these geometric lines that I did early on, and you begin to, again, not looking away from your reference, make up some of that information where we could begin to see the actual pose, all of the parts of the muscle, all of the parts of the limb, everything the torso is doing. And little by little, carve out the rest of the form. And again, looseness, key, absolute key. Observation is mandatory. That's the one thing you have to practice and have to maintain your focus on. And I'm not just tracing over. I'm actually making small little adjustments to what were geometric, linear, angular lines. And now I'm actually thinking about a little bit about just muscular sense. If any, some of that bone structure. And overall, just thinking about that weight, the weight of the pose. And time is up. So, as you can see, in 10 minutes, and make sure you label this one your 10-minute. Nothing more than enjoyment of the process. No matter what this looks like, I honestly shouldn't care. But I do look at it, and I can actually see, learn, hopefully learn from it. Okay, I could see that. Did I see what I was supposed to? Did I see it how I'm supposed to see it? Was I rushing through? Am I making good connections, good relationships? My proportion? And step by step, drawing by drawing, you're going to make those subconscious corrections. They will be there as you learn from this product. So you see this as the product of your process. The reason you look at it is to continue analyzing. And you could place it like that, side by side, and see anything that you would immediately, what stands out? What can I fix next time? How can I focus a little bit stronger on maybe volume, on maybe proportion, on simpler forms, on maybe technique of mark making? So with that, I'm actually very eager. I hope you really enjoyed it. This was a lot of fun.